Welcome to the gorgeous seaside village of Runswick Bay, an idyllic and historic fishing village perched on the spectacular cliffs of the Yorkshire coast. Located just a stone's throw up the coast from Whitby, Runswick Bay is today a popular holiday spot with so many charms that draw in visitors, from a sprawling sandy beach to narrow lanes, steep cliffs, and yet more stunning Yorkshire scenery at its finest. On this walk, we'll get lost in the labyrinth of lanes that make up the historic fishing village of Runswick Bay, which is full of fascinating stories. But we begin looking out over the sprawling bay itself, along which there skirts the immense Runswick Sands, the spectacular local beach which in 2020 was named as Britain's best beach of all. Stretching along the curve of the bay for just over half a mile, the wide sands are the perfect place to relax by the sea, and even on hot summer's evenings like today, the beach isn't all too busy, thanks in part to some very clever local planning. Along this stretch of the coast, the beaches at Saltburn, Staithes, Whitby and Scarborough are all easy to reach and as such extremely popular, but that's not quite the case here in Runswick Bay. As you'll have noticed from the surrounding scenery, the village of Runswick Bay is hidden right at the bottom of some very steep cliffs, and while there is one singular road that leads down to the shore here, there are only 80 parking spaces available for visitors, intended to ensure that the beach never becomes too overwhelmed, allowing Runswick Bay to retain its wonderfully serene atmosphere. You can of course walk down to the beach here too from the bus stop at the top of the cliffs, but the climb down and back up is extremely steep, even more so than the notorious drop down to the harbour in nearby Robin Hood's Bay. Owing to that, many of the people who visit Runswick Bay here choose to stay in the village for a few days, in the cottages perched on the cliffs in front of us, the vast majority of which today serve as holiday homes for visitors. And now, we'll head away from the beachside to explore the winding village lanes. But let's take a quick look at a map to see exactly where Runswick Bay is. One of a number of tiny villages on the Yorkshire coast, Runswick Bay lies just 5 miles northwest of Whitby and 10 miles southeast of Saltburn by the sea. Now, as you'll no doubt know, you're spoilt for choice when it comes to picturesque villages on the Yorkshire coast, but Runswick Bay has a unique charm, as one of the smallest villages on the coast, situated on one of its widest beaches. As we look down this vibrant slipway with the lifeboat station to our left, Runswick Bay here is actually more of a hamlet than a village, composed of just a few lanes, most of which don't even have names, and houses are not numbered, but rather named things like Seaview. It's all very quaint round these parts, and while it can be difficult to find exactly where you're going in this village, there are few better places to get lost. If you're here on holiday, you can spend a surprisingly long time trying to navigate your way out of the heart of the village, winding between houses lived in mostly by tourists today. But that wasn't always the case. In fact, Runswick Bay has only been a year-round holiday spot since the 1980s, and, like many other coastal settlements in this region, the village finds its origins in traditional fishing, with a settlement having existed on this site since at least the medieval era. However, due to its position under especially steep cliffs with no gentler inlet further inland, the fishing village of Runswick Bay never managed to develop in size or stature like nearby Staithes or Robin Hood's Bay, both of which by the 18th century were engaged in both traditional fishing and substantial international trade with European nations across the North Sea. Around the same time in history, however, Runswick Bay saw its fortunes turned completely upside down, as in the year 1682, the medieval fishing village that had existed here was entirely destroyed by an enormous landslide that washed all of the old fishing houses down into the sea as the cliffs behind us gave way. But over the years, Runswick Bay was rebuilt, with this rather modern house dating from 1890, and I suppose the clock on its wall serves as Runswick Bay's clock tower, in absence of any village hall. As a small hamlet, you won't find many of the main facilities seen in most villages, with the vast majority of buildings being dwellings, the only exceptions to this being the lifeboat station that we saw earlier, along with a small pub and a former Methodist Chapel. We'll pass by that former chapel in a little while, but where did the fishing people of medieval Runswick Bay go to worship before it was built? Well, as we now make our way into the village's narrowest streets, the locals from before the landslide of 1682 had to travel quite the distance to attend church, the nearest place of worship being the historic St Hilda's Church, about a mile and a half's walk up the cliffs in the village of Hinderwell. Runswick Bay, which can officially be classed as a hamlet rather than a village as it doesn't have a church, was historically based around Hinderwell's parish church of St Hilda, which was founded all the way back in the 12th century. In the aftermath of the landslide of 1682, however, you might think that that would have provided the opportunity to build a church here in Runswick Bay, but this never came to pass owing to the difficult terrain and the village's still tiny population. Even today, population stats are fairly hard to come by when it comes to this village, as there are rather few permanent residents, although you will still find a few cottages here and up on top of the cliffs that are home to a handful of long-term residents, albeit they are certainly in a minority when compared to holidaymakers. As a result of this, the local population here swings wildly throughout the year, with a peak of around 2,000 people in the summer season. But don't let that put you off visiting during the warmer months. Runswick Bay is absolutely spectacular in the summer, with stunning views to be seen from the cottages overlooking the bay and the village. The cliffs over in the distance are among the tallest on the coast here, at their highest standing an ominous 375 feet or 114 metres over the sea. And at the top of those cliffs, you'll find Runswick Bay's coastal neighbour, the hamlet of Kettleness, once upon a time one of the larger villages in this region, as it was once a hub of heavy industry. In contrast to Runswick Bay, which has almost forever been focused on fishing and fishing alone, Kettleness was the site of everything from alum and ironstone works to mines for jet, which is popularly sold as jewellery down in Whitby. Because of that industry, Kettleness, despite being a hamlet, actually had its own railway station, one of two within the vicinity of Runswick Bay here. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but here we now find ourselves beside Runswick Bay's former Methodist Chapel. Built in 1829, this chapel is the only official place of worship to have existed in Runswick Bay, and rather interestingly for its time, it was built almost exclusively by the women of the village. Most, if not all, of the men in Runswick Bay worked as fishermen out at sea all day long, and so it was the local women who were tasked with building the chapel from local stone, extracted from the ground up on top of the cliffs. But with such narrow and steep lanes and slopes leading down to the heart of the village here, stone couldn't just be brought in by horse and cart. The women of Runswick Bay actually had to carry each stone on their heads down the cliffs and to this point by the sea, before climbing back up and repeating the process. Beside the old chapel now, we find ourselves near the bottom of the village's lanes, with the steep stairs flattening out a little. That being said, it's still a steep drop down to the sea from here, as there's no beach lining the shore on this side of the bay. The shore at the end of the beach here, marked instead by rocks, which are underwater at high tide. Rock pooling among the rocks that we can see out in front of us is a popular holiday activity for visitors here, but just up ahead we can see an interesting landmark in the form of a small thatched cottage, reputed to be the only thatched house on the entirety of the Yorkshire coast. We'll get a closer look at that thatched cottage when we take a walk along the sea wall in a couple of minutes, but let's return to the story of Runswick Bay's neighbour, Kettleness, whose industry led to the opening of a railway station on the line from Middlesbrough to Whitby. On that same line on this side of the bay, meanwhile, a station was opened at Hinderwell in 1883, and which operated until 1958. Like Kettleness, when Hinderwell station was first opened, it mostly greeted rail traffic that was associated with heavy industry. But as time went by, this industrial rail stop inadvertently put this village, the once totally isolated coastal settlement of Runswick Bay, within reach of visitors from the outside. Of course, with its stunning scenery and picturesque village lanes, word of Runswick Bay's charm gradually began to spread, laying the groundwork for the village becoming the popular holiday destination that it is today. And having now made our way through the labyrinth of narrow lanes that make up the heart of the modern village, we find ourselves on the sea wall, looking towards that notable cottage, said to be the only thatched roof house on the Yorkshire coast. Once upon a time, the cottage was the home of the Coastguard at Runswick Bay, but like many of the other buildings in the heart of the village, it's now used as a holiday home. However, it is the only listed building in the lower part of Runswick Bay here, by the sea underneath the cliffs. While up on top of the cliffs, you'll find the settlement of Runswick Bank Top, home to a smattering of houses, a hotel, and a popular campsite. Long-distance walkers will likely pass through Runswick Bank Top, as it lies on the Cleveland Way, the legendary cliff-top footpath that runs all the way along this stretch of coast, and for a total of 109 miles, offering some of the most spectacular scenery and history that you'll find anywhere in England. There's even more to the history of this region than industry and fishing, as this coast is well known for its historical association with smuggling, which was also practiced right here in Runswick Bay, as traders sought to bring their goods into England duty-free, protected from the eyes of the law by the steep cliffs around us here. Runswick Bay's extreme isolation was rather ideal for smuggling, but this village never managed to develop into the major hive of smuggling on the level of nearby Robin Hood's Bay, most significantly because despite the height of the cliffs, the bay here is wider and more exposed, meaning secret smuggling was a little more difficult. What's more, smuggling in this region was taking off around the turn of the 18th century, but with Runswick Bay having only just been destroyed by the landslide of 1682, the locals were a little more focused on rebuilding their homes than making it rich with smuggling. Amazingly, nobody was killed in that devastating landslide, as the villagers had been warned of the avalanche by a pair of mourners attending a nearby wake. And speaking of saving people's lives, here we find ourselves beside Runswick Bay's delightful little lifeboat station, which was built in 1866. The lifeboat was historically deployed from here out to sea to rescue fishermen in trouble, not only here, but also in the neighbouring village of Staithes just 2 miles up the coast. That system remained in place until about 1978, when the lifeboat station here was closed, and Staithes' own historic station was reopened. However, as Runswick Bay then went on to cement itself as a popular tourist destination, with many people bathing in the sea, a more local lifeboat was needed, and so in 1982, the locals of Runswick Bay clubbed together and bought their own boat to station by the beach. Officially, Runswick Bay is still covered by the lifeboat at Staithes, but volunteers have been operating the one here for 40 years now, ever since this village became a holiday hotspot back in the 1980s. Now before the 80s, Runswick Bay had gradually evolved from purely a fishing village into a modest tourist hotspot, as word spread of the area from visitors brought by the railway, but holidaymakers were still only tending to come here in the summer. The winters, meanwhile, were almost entirely empty, as the rough winds and waves of the North Sea battered the village. But while the weather hasn't exactly changed in that time, Runswick Bay has become well known for more than just its beach and summer attractions. As we can see from this colourful collection on the Slipway, kayaking is a popular pastime with visitors in both the summer and the winter, and coupled with the likes of surfing and a variety of other water sports, Runswick Bay is a lively place even when it's cold and windy. Fortunately, however, it's still wonderfully warm on this glorious evening, with many people still relaxing on the wide beach of Runswick Sands, the place where you'll also find many of the best views of the cliffs, the sea, and the houses that we've been walking among. Having navigated the often claustrophobic lanes at the heart of the seaside village, the wide-open Runswick Sands feels like an entirely different world, but the contrasts of the expansive landscape and the tightly packed village centre are just another part of the immense charms of Runswick Bay. And as we spin around to look back towards the village itself, The way that this small fishing village was constructed and squeezed into the small space of land between the sea and the cliffs, and then rebuilt again, is testament to people's ability to settle just about any landscape. Looking up just behind the houses, we can see an exposed outcrop that looms above the historic thatched Coastguard's cottage. But there's no need to worry about another landslide anytime soon, as millions have been spent protecting Runswick Bay from erosion in recent years. With a strong sea wall to boot, that means that this gorgeous village will be around for a long while to come, forever transporting visitors back in time, just as I hope you've felt as we've walked through the village today. However, here on Runswick Sands, we're now coming to the end of our walk around the wonderful village of Runswick Bay. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you're now looking forward to visiting Runswick Bay for yourself in future too.